What are you going to do now?
Find out who was murdered. And then find the murderer.
Welcome to Season 5 of How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. It's 1944, and Eloise Ross joins us to discuss Laura and Otto Preminger. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, a link to our Discord, or just to say hi. Hello, everyone. We are here with Eloise Ross.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. And you're coming in from, I think, Australia, are you?
Yeah, Melbourne, Australia.
You're opening up a new time zone for us. Before we get started, do you want to tell us and the listeners a little more about yourself?
I am a lecturer in the film and TV area at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. I've been there for a while now, but I do travel a lot and I like to go to America and go to Bologna film festivals. A lot of my travel is kind of targeting a lot of films and fanciful things up in the Northern Hemisphere. So that's sort of why I guess I said yes to be on your podcast. It's really exciting to be part of something that is outside of Australian production.
As far as Lubitsch content goes, if anyone here wants to listen to more of Eloise's work with regards to Lubitsch, I highly recommend her commentary on the indicator release of Bluebeard's Eighth Wife. It's terrific. It's how I found out about you. And yeah, so listen to that. It's a great rundown of the context of that movie.
I am one of the co-curators of the Melbourne Cinematheque here in Melbourne. And even before I came on as a co-curator, Lubitsch has been a big staple of our programming. And I think there was a period of maybe 4 or 5 years where we always had a Lubitsch film in the year-long program. I mean, he's just so wonderful and appealing and fun to watch with an audience. He's definitely one of the crowd favourites, I think everywhere, but especially fun to be able to put his films on in Melbourne.
I find it very fascinating how every single one of his films I've seen in the cinema with people, it has brought the house down. I finagled the local film festival cinema into playing The Merry Widow, which is a film that the programmer had not actually seen and was not that familiar with. But on the strength of my recommendation, it just it brought the house down. And I just went, wow, for a filmmaker who's fallen so far out of the public consciousness, it really feels unfair that his films are just so instantly likable.
You know, and we'll talk about this, I think, when we talk about Laura and Preminger, but that period of time in the early 40s, maybe where the Lubitsch touch had fallen out of favor. Now it's back again. Everyone loves it.
Yeah, there's been kind of a nice resurgence of scholarship about Lubitsch recently, which has made actually this podcast much easier to do. I've had a lot of thinking of which to, stand on the top of shoulders of. Today we're talking about Otto Preminger. We'll be discussing him actually imminently in our episode about the last few films of Ernst Lubitsch's life. But that's not a context that is frankly flattering to Otto. He came in and did some questionable things with 2 projects that Lubitsch originated. I was really excited to do this episode for 2 reasons. One, I want to have some spirited generosity towards old Otto, who is a director, even though in the context of the Lubitsch story, he has a checkered record. He is a director I deeply love for so many reasons. Formally, emotionally, just his films fill me with joy. And the film of his that I think fills me with the most joy is this film, 1944's Laura, which was his breakout. At least it kind of solidified his career, which we can discuss this in a second, but had been on the rocks due to some failures with regards to Zanuck and promising that he would never direct at Fox again at some point. And here he is directing at Fox. So Preminger, his career and life parallel Ernst Lubitsch's in many specific ways, right? I mean, they both started life in Austria-Hungary. They were both apprentices of Max Reinhardt. They both left in the 1920s, 30s. Lubitsch, because Hollywood came calling, Pickford brought him over.
So they do, unfortunately, or fortunately for us, because we got a bunch of movies, I think, share connections or parallels. Lubitsch came from Europe to Hollywood in, I think, 1923. And started in Hollywood, had this really big career. And I think last went back to Germany in maybe 1933, never to return because he sensed how dangerous things were in Europe. And Otto Preminger was there working as well in a Reinhardt theatre in a quite powerful position, I think, and then was called to Hollywood in 1935. He got the sense that Austria was very quickly or very completely being overtaken by Nazis, and so he moved to Hollywood as well when he was invited there by Joseph Skunk. And he wanted to move his family. They came quite a little bit later, but he certainly was I guess we could say, pushed out by the Nazis rising.
I think it's worth noting, too, that Preminger, part of what kind of opened the door for him to even come to Hollywood in the first place was the fact that Lubitsch came over and kind of instigated this wave of connection between German and American cinema, where a whole lot of the best and brightest of writers and directors, a lot of them Jewish from Germany, emigrated to Hollywood and started their own little community. And Preminger immediately, upon arriving, became ingratiated with that community. He was apparently a guest at Lubitsch's various Sunday dinner parties or brunches or whatever time of day they had their food. And he had this meteoric rise from an actor in the Reinhardt Company to I think by 29, he was directing his own plays, unlike Lubitsch, who never really directed plays.
And the funny thing is as well is that Preminger, or at least from what I've read, directed a lot of comedy plays. He's not necessarily famous for directing a lot of comedy films, but that he got that start says maybe a lot about his talent.
That's probably a good bridge into what makes Laura so interesting for me, because you look up its genre on Letterboxd or IMDb or whatever, it's listed as a film noir, but I kind of cheekily put the film on my favorite romantic comedies list because for me, the film is so tonally divorced from what I think most people expect out of a noir. I mean, there's more lighthearted noirs on the spectrum of noirs, but this is about as cheeky as a noir gets. It's a noir with a very light touch, which is not something I usually attribute to Preminger. I mean, this is the man who made Exodus, and I just watched Bunny Lake is Missing, which is definitely not a lighthearted film.
I mean, I came to Preminger most concretely through his very different noir Where the Sidewalk Ends from 1950, also Dana Andrews and Gene Tierney, but that's very clearly a New York noir. I do think Laura is a noir, but it is a different kind. I mean, it's set, basically everything's in the interior. Apart from the one murder, there's no sense of danger anywhere in the film. There's nothing at all is sort of creepy. There's a reference to Mark McPherson, the detective played by Dana Andrews, having been involved in a big gangster crime solution.
He has a leg full of lead.
Yeah, but nowhere else is there any sense of kind of sinister entrapment or danger in the film, which is really essential to the noir atmosphere.
I find it so beguiling, this movie. The phrase that comes to mind for me is casually surreal. It's a whodunit where no one really seems in much of a rush to figure out who done it. Our lead character, McPherson, played wonderfully by Dana Andrews. He has this little game he plays, right? I don't mean in a metaphorical sense. I mean, he literally has a little pocket game seemingly to calm down his nerves because of that, maybe a rage he feels. But the effect is to make him feel extremely uninterested in the murder, and he'll interrogate people at a party. He'll do things with evidence that no police officer should do, careless things. It almost feels like the movie is, and the characters are more interested in just playing their parts and having fun with it than with actually solving this murder.
It's really interesting, especially when we think about where the film came from and how it was made, that when Preminger took over direction of the film, because he was originally producer and Ruben Mamoulian had directed a couple of scenes. When Preminger took over, it became maybe something of this atmosphere that you're talking about with this particular lighthearted attitude. I imagine that Mamoulian was maybe directing it in a more straightforward detective story type of manner. And Vincent Price actually said when Preminger came in and started directing them in a different way, none of the actors responded well. They didn't necessarily like Preminger's attitude or approach to the material, but they slowly realized that what he was doing was trying to direct them all so as to make it seem like this was a really well-behaved social set, like a commentary on this murder that occurs where you can't possibly imagine that anyone is actually a murderer because they're all too wrapped up in their own fantasies of upper-class behavior.
They're all such dopes.
Yeah, they are. They all really are so invested in their own progression in society that you can't possibly imagine any of them thinking about anyone else enough to do murder.
You kind of touched upon it, and this might be a good thread to pull on now, is the film's kind of really rocky production, right? Because every single passage I read about this book, they've made sure to mention that no one believed in this project except Otto Preminger. So he comes across this serialized novel, Ring Twice for Laura by Vera Caspary, and falls in love with what he calls is the gimmick, which is that a woman incriminates herself by just coming home. She's supposed to be dead. She comes home and therefore becomes the prime suspect. And he just loved that, which that's something Hitchcock would say. And then he's had this falling out with Zanuck years earlier. And partially maybe as a result of that, he is not allowed to direct this movie. McMullian is brought in because Zanuck has no confidence in Preminger as a director.
Yeah, it is a really interesting narrative. I guess I should say real life story in the lead up to the production and the final product of this film. And maybe one of the reasons why it is so famous is not because it is a really spectacular noir or a really spectacular melodrama, but because it is strange and out of this period of unsettled production and all of these fights behind the scenes between like authorship and what the perspective was, that something really magical and unintended came out of this that was down to Preminger having faith in it, but also people like Zanuck and other people behind the scenes kind of meddling a little bit. So this sense of strangeness, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but what Zanuck wanted to do with the voiceovers and with the perspectives really messed this film up. But Ruben Mamoulian was director for a while. I think they threw out all of his scenes. I think they asked Lewis Milestone, and Lewis Milestone said, no, this seems like Preminger knows how to make this film. I don't want to do it. But when Preminger got invited finally by Zanuck, because they'd had this big screaming match, this is in the Chris Fujiwara book, he's like, no one shouted at Zanuck. Zanuck just shouted at people. Preminger, if you can imagine, shouted back at him and so was kind of ostracized for a little bit, but came back on and could produce. And then when he was allowed to direct finally, he wanted to make all of these changes, and he did, like to the crew, to the cinematographer, to the portrait, the famous portrait. And Lubitsch said, you should just do what they say. You're lucky enough to be back here. You know, so another example of Preminger really, well, I don't know if he listened to Lubitsch's advice in this case, but they were both working in parallel in Hollywood and helping each other along.
The difference in working style between Preminger and Lubitsch is fascinating to me, because the stories of Preminger coming on to finish That Lady in Ermine are very disheartening, because everyone, including Vincent Price, who otherwise liked the guy, says he comes on and the party's over. Lubitsch was nothing if not a people person, and Preminger was a real taskmaster by reputation. He seemed to inspire quite a bit of loyalty among certain people, but he was known to be just like, a bit dictatorial on his sets. He didn't have that way of just gliding into any circumstance like Lubitsch might have, and just kind of easing as many egos as possible. He had his own bullish way of doing things.
I don't think he was very interested in making friends. He was interested in the picture. That's his style. They're certainly reading about it. Was he a horrible person? Was he this dictatorial asshole? Or was he just trying to do everything in service of a picture? And if you try and contrast his directing style with Lubitsch, I haven't read much about his directing style, but if he was in fact nice and friendly and fun on set, even though he was a workaholic, he still made these what seemed like effortlessly exquisite pictures while not being cruel.
It's funny because we've talked about quite a few classic Hollywood directors at depth in this podcast now. And there's kind of a spectrum where Lubitsch is on one end, where it's very rare to find someone with more than a couple bad words to say about his directing style, at least as a collaborator. And then on the other end, you have someone like Joseph von Sternberg, who no one has a kind word to say about that. He was just a chore to be around, and everyone just wanted to get away from him. So, I mean, Preminger seems to fall somewhere in the middle of that, where he really seems to have done some very conspicuously generous things for people. There's partisans in the Chris Fujiwara book, you'd say, who, when interviewed, speak very highly of him, which you will never find with Sternberg. And yet he is just this complete, single-minded, he will seem to plow through as many obstacles as possible to get his exact vision on the screen. I feel like Preminger's style, his directing style, it really seems to carry through in his images, because one of my favorite things about his films, in fact, the thing that really turned me on to his films, was his camera movement. And the way that his camera is just so, like Joseph Lechal's movements in this, I think, are some of my favorite in cinema, where it'll start with a wide shot, and instead of cutting into a close-up, the camera will just, as if someone's shoving it, and the camera operator's like, whoa, it's almost impossibly fast and smooth. The smoothness of the dolly work in this movie is beyond belief. And it'll end in a close-up that's at least 2 feet closer than you thought possible. And the lighting will still be great. So it really feels like the visual work of someone who is in a rush to get where he wants to be in that way.
There must have been lots of rehearsal time. I mean, if you think about that moment in the interrogation studio where Jean Tierney has the lights on her and she says,
Mhm.
turn them off, they're awful. And they're turned off. And then she's bathed in still this incredible light where you can still see her face. In some films, when they turn a light off and then another light turns on more broadly to see the frame, you can see that very split-second moment.
When like both lights are off for like half a second.
Yeah, which I think is really quite fun. And I like those moments, but that doesn't happen here. It's so exquisite. I guess I'm getting a bit away from the point, which is the camera movements. And there's one in Where the Sidewalk Ends, which is also incredible, where Jean Tierney is introduced and she plays a model and she's sort of in the background of this gambling house and she walks into the camera, into the lens and then out again in almost this concave movement.
Yes.
Where she's not truncated or she's not sort of interrupted in her flow. And we get to see this body and its movement, not just a face or not just a figure. But Preminger really shows us, I think, whole spaces and whole rooms.
There's a continuity to time in his movies, and one might point to maybe like the influence of Kane, etc., the prevalence of longer takes in this time. But I love how Preminger, in this case especially, folds those innovations into a very studio down the middle aesthetic in other ways, right? Where it's still master shots, it's still people talking in that kind of proscenium way, but he's stringing together these takes in a very unshowy way. It doesn't have like the ego of Rope or something.
That's an interesting comparison because I was going to talk about how Laura is not a single set film, but it's very, very focused on Laura Hunt's apartment.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously we get these other spaces, but you don't feel trapped, I think, because of the way the camera moves. And the camera is always pivoting, rarely cutting from or cutting around, but pivoting around the portrait, which is in the center of this apartment. And so you feel incredibly open and incredibly sort of welcome in this space that, at least for the first half, is a dead woman's apartment.
You have that lovely shot where after Lydecker accuses Mark of falling in love with a corpse, where you have the dolly in, but the dolly in rearranges itself midway through to perfectly frame Laura's portrait in the back. It almost feels like the axis of action is not between two characters as it would be in a regular film. It's between whatever character's on screen and the portrait.
And that sort of gets to something of Laura, the film's reputation, which is it famous only because of the status of the portrait or the iconic use of this portrait to reflect a perfect woman who could never really exist in reality? And I don't necessarily agree, although it's certainly part of it. And I think it's the status of the portrait in popular culture. I was reading the actual portrait was used in a couple of other 20th Century Fox films later on, including another one with Clifton Webb, where he had the portrait in the background of his study. I can't remember what the film was called, but, you know, it's kind of embedded in our culture. And we recognize Laura for things like Jean Tierney's appearance, and obviously it is one of the earliest recognized films noir. Whether it is or not, we can talk about that now, but in this particular period of the mid-1940s, it certainly was, which is amazing. Now, is it famous because of the portrait and the score? I think. I mean, David Raxon's score is something also we have to talk about. But the portrait kind of has this ethereal, undefinable quality that I feel is also attributed to the film.
I was actually about to bring up the score because David Raxon's song, he comes up, it's a standard, right? It's The Saints Go Marching In. It's a level of like everyone knows it. But I would also point maybe to all the films that deliberately call back to it. I mean, Twin Peaks is undeniable here. Probably the majority of people I know who have seen Laura in my kind of cohort saw it because they heard that it was a big inspiration for Twin Peaks, actually. And in so many ways, it's very obvious how it influenced Lynch.
Yeah, I mean, Laura Palmer, the name of Laura was taken by Lynch for his dead character at the center of his narrative. The TV show uses her portrait so frequently throughout the show, not just as a conversation piece or a narrative device, but in the background. And in Twin Peaks The Return, it becomes even more present, where, do you remember the opening credits of Twin Peaks The Return is just those pine trees with the portrait superimposed over it. So it becomes even more pronounced in this later iteration, which I think keeps the influence of the 1944 Laura alive.
Both works deal with a murdered young woman who we only experience, at least for the first half of Laura, through the eyes of all the men, especially, who are imprinting on her. And then when we meet the real version, in the case of Fire Walk With Me, for example, the Laura who lives and breathes has very little resemblance to the version that we have been trained to recognize.
I think that when Laura comes back into the apartment after Mark McPherson has fallen asleep, and then he wakes up and sees her. He thinks she's dead, but now all of a sudden she's in front of him. I think that moment would be so much more powerful if we hadn't had the flashbacks before. So we'd never, in fact, seen her alive, and that our only knowledge of her would be through the portrait and the memories of it.
I'm so glad you brought up that scene, because the scene in which Laura returns in Laura, this is a spoiler-heavy podcast, folks. Laura's not dead. That scene, to me, is the linchpin of this film's monumental weirdness. I mean, we've talked about some of the weirdness in the fact that no one is in a rush to solve this murder, it seems. But this is kind of the scene that I fell in love with the movie. I actually first saw this film when I was like 20 or 21, way, way back. And it was in a noir class. And this was one of about 10 noirs we watched, one of which was also Where the Sidewalk Ends. So we got 2 Premingers. But this one was immediately my favorite. And this scene immediately became one of my favorite scenes in film. And it's because of the way that the film plays with dream logic and a prosaic reality. So you have this lovely scene where Dana Andrews, Mark, the cop, kind of goes on a date with Laura. He goes on a date with her portrait. He pours drinks, rifles through her lingerie. It's wonderfully creepy. And he sits down on this easy chair and falls asleep. And there's this shot that is played like a reveal, right? It slow dollies into his drink, dollies back out. Nothing's changed. And every single time I watch the film, I have the exact same thought. Oh, this is a dream sequence now. We've departed reality. And Laura comes in, though. Gene Tierney, in this moment, there's no glamorous close-up. She's shot from wide in a raincoat. It's clear that they're trying to make the raincoat look plain. It's impossible, though. It looks amazing. But she comes in, and suddenly we're in this very prosaic shot, reverse shot that does nothing but emphasize the reality of the situation. I'm actually amazed that this hasn't become like a Minority Report thing where there's a common theory that it was all a dream in the second half. Because I think if any film is asking for it, it's this.
I think there is a common kind of conspiracy theory that it's all a dream in the second half. There are several people who think so. I mean, one of the reasons is because of that magnificent tracking in and then tracking out.
It's so good. Yeah.
But also it's a way to kind of answer the question of, is Laura dead or not, in a really consumable way. I mean, Zanuck even, so there's an interesting story to how everything maybe went wrong or was kind of mishandled, and then what we got was this magnificent creation, because the novel originally, the Vera Cathbury novel, had 3 narrations, 3 narrative voices, Waldo, Mark and Laura Hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And in the film, I think they initially started with those 3 narrations as well. So we had Waldo Lydecker's, and that's the one we're stuck with. I think the original version of the script, or even a couple of different drafts, still Mark McPherson having a voiceover, and Dana Andrews even recorded one, but it was ultimately cut. And then I don't think that Gene Tierney ever did, but that's one of the reasons to maybe explain the strangeness and that perspective. There was an initial preview screening of Laura that didn't go well, apparently. And Zanuck said, let's just have this line saying, it was all a dream.
Yeah, they changed the ending into one that doesn't sound good at all.
Yeah, and then they reverted back to the OG one, thank goodness. But I feel like that sense of maybe this was all a dream still stuck. It's still embedded there somehow.
It's a tremendously weird feeling, isn't it? I mean, every time I watch the film, I'm just like, whoa, film, you've just opened a Pandora's box. And then the second half of the film trucks along like nothing's happened. It feels like the happiest accident because it gives the film this tension that is never resolved that I love.
And it's not really interested in solving the tension, as you say, or resolving the tension. I mean, part of that, I think, as well, is in the voiceover. So there's all of this discussion, and I know David Bordwell discusses it because he's quite interested in narrative innovation in the 1940s. And where does Waldo's voiceover come from? Because his first line is,
"I shall never forget the weekend Laura died."
It's so lovely and poetic, but then it's clearly not coming from after the film because he's dead. And so was it a mistake? Is it intentional that it's supposed to be ironic? Well, in fact, we thought Laura was dead, but all along it's actually Waldo who's now dead. There's something very peculiar.
The choice of the word weekend is what gets me. Because if you say, I'll never forget the day Laura died, that's a fixed moment in time, right? But a weekend is like weirdly specifically segmented. He says it as if it was like, that one weekend she died and, we've been friends ever since. Yeah, that mystery, right? I mean, it's also a terrific bit of misdirection because you're thinking, if you're actually approaching the film as a whodunit, you're thinking, it can't have been this guy, or he can't be the villain because he's clearly still alive. And we can also talk about Clifton Webb as a thing because he might be my single favorite thing about this movie.
He's so good. And I have to say, I just watched the TV episode version of Laura filmed in 1955 as part of a Fox TV thing that I watched yesterday. It's like 40 minutes. It's very truncated. They only use one set. Characters are removed. Judith Anderson's character is not there because obviously she adds a layer of complexity that television can't possibly deal with. But George Sanders is Waldo Lydecker, and I feel like he's the only other imaginable Waldo other than Clifton Webb, but he still doesn't work. He's still not right.
So Waldo Lydecker, his entrance in this film is one of my favorite villain introductions ever, where he's in a bath. Anya on this viewing mentioned that you can actually clearly see his underwear, but he's clearly supposed to be nude and just shameless and very, very like coded camp gay as well, in a way that feels, I mean, I think Clifton Webb gives the character so much wonderful just life. And just immediately he is this absurdly campy character that kickstarts this chain of illogic in the film, weirdly. He basically says, hey, I know I'm the prime suspect, but can I come along and like be your buddy?
I mean, it's the perfect alibi, right?
Yeah. How can I be a suspect? I'm part of the investigation. But every single line, he's given all the best lines in the film, and boy, does Clifton make a meal of them.
Yeah, and the thing I noticed the last time I watched it is that part of his intro voiceover is it was one of the hottest Sundays I can remember. And then he's in the bathtub and I'm like, was he having an ice bath or a cold bath? Like, what's going on? But he's so fantastic. And I mean, Preminger was right. I think Zanuck wanted to cast Monty Woolley as Waldo. Can you imagine?
Oh my
He would be
gosh.
so brusque and just such a different character. But cast Clifton Webb specifically because he wasn't really a screen star. He was a stage actor and he wasn't known. So you wouldn't pinpoint him as the murderer immediately, which was really important. Part of this was that Preminger wanted everyone to be considered a suspect, including Laura.
Mm-hmm.
And I never really believed that Laura is a suspect.
No.
But that was important to Preminger.
His wording, I think, at least in the Fujiwara book, is that he wants someone who is either unknown or had never played a heavy. And Clifton Webb, he's so magnetic that, yeah, one almost doesn't want him to be the murderer, but he's such a wonderful piece of shit. And yet he wins every scene. He always has the legitimately incredible put-downs of everyone else. But part of the reason why Zanuck was skeptical of Webb's ability to play the role, or that he was a good idea, was basically that he was known to be gay. But to me, that's what makes the character, right? The fact that Clifton Webb plays him as such a wonderful dandy.
Just think what it would mean.
You seem to be completely disregarding something more important than your career.
What?
My lunch.
Yeah, I agree. And there is still moments in the film where he and Preminger are allowed to lean into that characterization.
Yes.
So there was all of this background, even in the script before production went ahead. But then I believe there's evidence that some scenes were cut from creating him or shaping him as this dandy or this queer-coded character. Breen demanded that, or the PCA demanded that certain insinuations be cut. But I watched the trailer for Laura, which was, I believe, the original trailer, which was an extra on my Where the Sidewalk Ends DVD that has a line in it, probably from an original plan where Waldo was doing his flashback about how he made Laura into this glamorous character. And he says, I introduced her to all the attractive hairdressers. But I'm just like, that's a line clearly that was too much, that it's not in the final film. That's one of those things that suggest Waldo knows too much about glamour and fashion.
The wildly mixed sources of the screenplay and conflicting impulses make his character so interesting because, yeah, he shouldn't work, right? He is both very queer-coded, and Clifton Webb plays that up, and yet he is a Svengali figure for Laura, or he thinks himself that. And at the same time, he is kind of this jilted, almost like slightly like, to use the parlance of our times, like an incel-ish, where he believes that he is owed a lifetime of romantic commitment because he is nice to Laura. And to me, those three things are very different characters. And yet that kind of contributes to the surreal nightmarishness of him and also the delight of seeing him on screen.
And I love his jealousy of Shelby Carpenter, Vincent Price character, because Vincent Price is also, I would argue, in this film, very dandy and almost queer-coded. And he's, in a lovable way, he's so pathetic.
I don't know a lot about anything, but I know a little about practically everything.
The final time we see him is when he's like crying into Judith Anderson's arms because Dana Andrews punched him in the stomach. It's so funny.
It's a totally unprovoked punch. That scene, the causal linkages break down so wonderfully.
I think it's both of those characters, Waldo and Shelby, contribute to some of the discourse around this film being considered this great feminist text because Shelby is this weak guy who can't be bothered getting a job, but control of his estate income has also been taken away from him. So he just latches on to other people with money. Waldo tries to get into her pants, maybe he does. That was what the PCA had a problem with, but maybe he doesn't. But still he hangs around and she has all of this power and she is a career woman. She kind of controls her own narrative, I think, which maybe sounds a little bit ironic given that she started the film as a dead woman. But then she came back and she kind of claimed it.
Where I haven't really sorted out my feelings in that reading is in her relationship to Mark, which is an interesting thing because one of this film's many minds, which are at war with each other, wants us to see Mark as this kind of breath of fresh air for her. He's this common, salt of the earth detective. He's seen some shit. And he comes in to, in his own words, free her from the dopes she's surrounded herself with.
I must say, for a charming, intelligent girl, you certainly surrounded yourself with a remarkable collection of dopes.
A line, though, here's the other thing that I would add. He says, as he's doing the single dopiest thing anyone does in the film, which is putting the shotgun back on the clock, which he basically sets up another attempt on her life. And again, I'm phrasing this almost like a criticism, but I actually love this about the film, where simultaneously Mark fulfills the role as this eat the rich, I'm better than these dandy-ish New York guys, salt of the earth detective, whilst there's still a through line in the film where he is just as bad as the rest of them. He's just next in line, maybe.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. He is so distinct from everyone else. He's very out of place. And why does Laura fall for him in the end? I really don't know. Is it because he doesn't have any of these airs about him that all of her other beaux have?
He at least feels different, but I'm never ever convinced that they're at all a good fit for each other at all. And again, I mean that with all the love in my heart for that, because that fact and the fact that I still want them to be together, to me, that little smile that Dana Andrews cracks, he basically tries to pitch it to her. As a police officer, I should know this. Are you going to marry Shelby? And then when she says no, he cracks the tiniest smile. And I still remember the first time I saw that, I cheered on the inside. That is a thrilling moment of performance.
It's such a ridiculous question. There is nothing to do with detective investigation about that question. And the next day they mock it up as though it could have had some detective worth by making her change her mind, and then he gets a little bit suspicious about Shelby and why she changed her mind. That was kind of like an afterthought. They were like, well, we can have this really horny line in there, but we have to kind of pretend that it made some sense.
But it's like the film stumbles into creating an all-time character. I love the scene where it's the next day, he's invited Shelby and Judith over for interrogation. And they come in and immediately he just dismisses them. He's like, okay, I need to talk to you after. And they're like, what the? And the film just plays it off like, okay, just another day in police work. But there's so many things he does in the film that just make zero sense and in fact almost impede the investigation. Like even the scene when he's shining lights in her face, it feels like the film is calling attention to that, where she's like, do you really need to shine those in my face? And he's like, I guess I didn't.
One of the things that is really exciting about this film is that it took place at this particular time where noir was coming onto the scene and narratives were changing and things were becoming a lot more psychological, interesting. Characters were becoming more three-dimensional. And when I think it's one of the French cinephiles who kind of started all of this writing on noir, he says that, what is it? It's Laura, The Maltese Falcon, Double Indemnity, and Murder, My Sweet are like these 4 films that signify a change in the detective film from just detective narrative to psychological crime picture or something. And this is one of the things that the writers identify, is that Mark McPherson is a detective with an emotional underbelly, or he's this character with this kind of intriguing psychology. And maybe that's it. He's clearly not a guy who just wants to get the job done, but he's got other interests. Maybe he's not that interested in police work anymore now that he's done his gangster thing. Maybe it is that he is so overwhelmed by this portrait of Laura that he can't possibly focus on any work, or that he just thinks their whole milieu is silly.
I think it's a bit of both. It feels like everyone in this film is driven by some psychological mix of libido and ego. No one actually does what the plot calls of them at any given moment. At any given point, every single person in the film could have easily resolved every conflict in their favor had they just done one or two things at any given moment, but they don't. It feels like a series of events that play out entirely because in the case of Mark, he really, I don't know if it's love, but he really wants to get with Laura. Waldo wants to get with Laura, even if it's just a power thing. Shelby really wants money. He also kind of wants to get with Laura, and Laura wants to get with the least bad of these men. That's part of why I kind of half jokingly call it a romantic comedy, because the logic that usually guides most noir of crime and money don't seem to really apply here.
That's really interesting. It's so true, and it is funny and silly, and, there are these happenstance occurrences. But I was thinking about the greatest line in the film, in my opinion, which is when Waldo asks Mark McPherson if he'd ever been in love, and Dana Andrews replies in his very dry, kind of monotone voice,
Doll in Washington Heights once got a fox fur out of me.
Which is so, so good. It's the best answer to "Have you ever been in love?" that I've ever heard, I think. And in Where the Sidewalk Ends, which I've already said is my favorite Preminger film, so I hope it's okay that I keep referring to it. I'm pretty sure that because Dana Andrews plays another detective called Mark Dixon, and he's trying to suppress this violent freak. He was the son of a criminal. Then he accidentally murders someone who is a war veteran. And Preminger also has this really interesting kind of subtext or direct text in a lot of his films where he references war trauma. But he is trying to find where the Jean Tierney character lives, and one of his colleagues tells him that she lives in an apartment in Washington Heights. I think that's correct. And I just thought, isn't that kind of a funny type of sequel reference to Laura somehow?
There's a lot of connections between those two films. I wish I had rewatched Where the Sidewalk Ends because I really loved it when I first saw it 10 years ago. There's one shot where I think it's the villain comes close to the camera lens in Where the Sidewalk Ends. He just comes closer and closer, and it's like up his nose. I have ripped off that shot in my own movies so many times. That blew my mind. It actually opened up doors for me, that one shot. In Bunny Lake, Preminger basically recreates it.
I feel like Where the Sidewalk Ends is a film that changed my life as well, or has really led me in specific directions. When I was 21, I went to New York. It was at the end of 2007, and there was a Otto Preminger retrospective at Film Forum, and I'd done a noir subject, but I don't think any Preminger films were screened. And I saw a whole bunch, and I saw Where the Sidewalk Ends, and I came back to Australia and I wrote my honours thesis on it because it just sort of changed my life. Like it introduced me to all of these potentials that I'd never quite thought of before. It's very good and it's very artistic, but it's also very straightforward. And then you get into all of the strange things that Preminger did.
I think the reason Laura stuck with me is I think it was Lucy Marzola who phrased it this way. It's the weird exceptions, the films that are so different from the films around them that kind of often make the biggest impression on us. And for me, that's part of why Laura, I think, made a huge impression on me in a way that Where the Sidewalk Ends I really loved. But Laura stuck with me in a way that it's like an enigma that cannot be solved because it's a broken movie. Where the Sidewalk Ends is a much more functional film. A and B connects. It's a functional noir. And with Laura, the thing I find really strange about its reputation is that it has this, if you look it up on any website that's like top 10 noirs and it'll be on there, it'll always say it's a great, murder mystery. And to me, I'm like, I don't think it is a great murder mystery. I don't think it works in the way that a lot of people act like it does, but that makes it better for me because it works on its own bizarre, twisted dream logic where no one does what you would expect of them.
I mean, you're right. I never realized this, but it's not a murder mystery because Mark McPherson is not interested in solving it. He doesn't do the detective work, and it never actually gets solved. No one figures out that it was Waldo, but Waldo reveals himself to be the murderer by attempting it again through this incredible scene where it leads in with his disembodied voice via the radio.
And thus, as history has proved, love is eternal. Love is stronger than life. It reaches beyond the dark shadow of death.
And then he trespasses back into this apartment, but there's no murder mystery or solution or resolution of anything in the film.
The shot the film ends on feels deliberately unsatisfying, where you have Gene Tierney and Dana Andrews in the foreground. The camera rushes into a clock, and that's the shot we end on. And that might get us to actually subject I've been dying to talk about with you, because you brought it up, is clocks in this movie. Because the film ends on a clock, very conspicuously, a broken clock. And the grandfather clocks, dual grandfather clocks, twins in the film, in Laura and Waldo's apartment, have, Chris Fujiwara makes a great deal of the symbolism, but I'm curious as to your read on the nature of clocks and time in this movie.
Yeah, I do really like the final scene, even though I don't think it's perfect. I think it uses the clocks really interestingly, both in a symbolic sense, but also just in a sense of sound design. So I wrote part of my PhD on the sound of clocks in films from this period and how they were particular kind of anxiogenic. Like you hear a clock ticking and you're immediately unsettled or worried about something. And this is such a peculiar film in that if it is a noir, it doesn't move outside really. There's no tension necessarily in a classical sense, but you get these clocks almost the whole duration of the film. There are these clocks in either apartment running, just ticking in the background. And it's brought into focus in that final sequence and really helps to, I think, hide Waldo in a sense, in a sonic sense. The sound of the clock, in fact, hides or allows him to hide a little bit because he's hiding in Gene Tierney's apartment. He doesn't want to be found. He makes a few noises, but she just kind of thinks, oh, well, in fact, it's the clock that's making this noise. But we in the audience know that it's not. And so there's this really interesting relationship that we have to the sonic space in this final scene.
I'll admit that the clocks in this film didn't register to me as much as they did with you until I read the Fujiwara book, which I'm going to include in the show notes because it's terrific. He posits the film as drawing a contrast between static time, which is the time of Waldo in his apartment, and his life, where, nothing can happen, where things are kind of encased. He is associated with this sort of extra diegetic stasis, where, like we say, he narrates the film from beyond the grave, from a time he could not. And most of his presence in the film is in the past tense. And then you have the forward time, the progressive time of the detective, always on the move, even when he's playing the game. But with him, Laura can move forward with her life, basically. It's the sense that things can actually happen when he's on screen.
Yeah, that's such a good reading. And it's really valuable to spend time on the clocks, I think, in whatever sense, because in the Vera Caspary novel, Waldo hides his gun in his cane. And there was this big back and forth. And when Vera Caspary was going, talking
about the believability of the shotgun that you can blow off someone's face with a cane.
Yeah. And she wanted Preminger to keep it in the cane, and I think so did Zanuck, but Preminger said, no, that's ridiculous. So it went into the clock, and it was a very purposeful decision to make the clock this narrative, and I think also atmospheric device. You get these senses that Vera Caspary was a bit cross that her story had been changed, but she wrote this article in 1971 for a newspaper or magazine, and she still said, I disagree, but Preminger does have more four-ball cinema ideas or understanding than I do. She seems a bit jaded by the whole thing.
It is so interesting that so many people involved in this film came away from it going, I could have done it better. I think Mamoulian has been very tight-lipped about the film since then, but one gets the sense, reading between the lines of what he has said about the film, that he was not happy with the direction.
It's very different style to the way he would have done it. It will be fascinating if we could, in fact, see some of those scenes that he directed and just see how different it is. But I don't think that's going to be possible.
Unfortunately not, although the film we got was, I can't imagine a better version of what the very weird thing we got.
It's true, but if you watch the TV episode version that I saw, directed by John Brahm, who interestingly I think Preminger disliked, although perhaps that's just a rumor, it's very static and very plain. It's not very good. It's quite dull, but it does give insight into why the film Laura is so wonderful, because obviously they had more space and more resources, but you could be a little bit stranger when it came to film than you could be on television, at least in the 1950s.
I'll say I was a bit probably generous towards it because I just love Robert Stack so much. I'm a huge Robert Stack fan.
He's a little boring, isn't he? I don't know.
In this film, this is not his finest ever.
I do like Robert Stack as well. I will give you that.
I think Stack really excels at not quite playing the straight down the middle type. I think he's at his best when he's doing some travesty on it in some way. But yeah, no, it is interesting how you see a version of it where Preminger is weirdly attuned to the brokenness of the film, clearly. Why else would he go to bat for Clifton Webb so much?
Yeah, I don't know, but he just wanted to get his way. And
Mhm.
it's peculiar because this is his first real success. I mean, he directed a couple of films before, and obviously he had this great theatre career, but this is his first film success. And you think, well, how did he know? He just
Yeah.
must have believed in himself somehow.
I mean, he had some weird confidence in the material that I might not have had confidence in. It is interesting how the career that followed this, though, I've never seen him try to do this again. I mean, Where the Sidewalk Ends is written about as like an attempt to recapture the magic just because it has the same two leads. It's a noir, but it's obviously not going for the same thing. And I can't think of another film he did after this where I'm like, okay, this has that same kind of winking playfulness. I mean, you also have Skidoo, which is its own bizarre winking thing, but that's a very different register.
I mean, I don't think he ever did do this again. I also really like Fallen Angel, which I think is similar in some of its thematic explorations, what it does with its two female leads, both playing against Dana Andrews, who is a detective in this film. I mean, I don't necessarily want to say what happens in that film here because this is not a podcast about Fallen Angel, but
I've also not seen that. That's probably my biggest Preminger blind spot.
It's really, really good and it's really atmospheric and it's kind of almost the opposite to Laura in some ways where a lot of it's exterior and it's set on this seaside town, but it does have some aesthetic and I think thematic similarities as well. And you get a sense that Preminger didn't want to necessarily play the game or do what was standard. I don't know, I've seen less of his films sort of after 1962, Advise and Consent. I don't think I've seen too many others, but I think he did start to play around with things in a different way.
Certainly formally. I mean, I just recently watched Bunny Like Is Missing and I was taken with how radical that movie is in so many ways. He's basically playing with French New Wave tools, right? He has tons of handheld camera, lots of location shooting, on-location interiors, which I have rarely seen in a studio picture from that era. And also just like jump cuts, actually. There's actual, for real, jump cuts in that movie. It's incredible.
I haven't seen that in a while and I remember not really thinking that it worked, but it is an interesting experiment. But I probably have to go back to it with the same level of attentive detail as I have some of his other films because I think that what you get with Preminger is below the surface. Like it's never just what's there, but there is so much more to think about. And that there are always connections between his films themselves, films he makes, and other cinema of his kind of contemporaries or what came before him. There's really a lot going on.
So I'm going to ask you at some point for people who liked Laura, where you would turn them next. I have an idea what you might do. Before I do that, are there any stones with Preminger or Laura that we haven't turned yet that you'd be remiss not to turn?
I have one interesting thing to bring up about Laura regarding 1944 and what was happening with noir and what was happening with masculinity around that time, which is that I read recently that there was an ending, I think it was shot, in fact, of Waldo Lydecker, in fact, remaining alive at the end of the film, which might explain his ultimate, as though he was a live voiceover, but that he went to the gas chamber and that we see him in the gas chamber. And I thought, well, Double Indemnity did that too. So Walter Neff goes to the gas chamber and there are those surviving photographs of him and Ed Robinson there. And the scene was shot, but it doesn't exist anymore. And this parallel between these two incredibly different, but both so culturally huge films from 1944, and neither of them stuck with that ending is very curious to me. Something that I want to think about a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, that does make sense in the way that the ending is paced, where it does feel, and again, I love this about it. I have a habit of saying things that sound like criticisms, but are actually praise. But the film does feel like it's missing a beat at the end, right? Where you have that kind of odd voiceover of "Goodbye, my sweet" after he falls dead off screen. It's very inconclusive in a funny way.
They're like, oh, let's just cut it there, maybe.
Yeah, cut to the portrait of Laura. We're out of here.
Yeah, and those kinds of, I guess we would call them Easter eggs these days, maybe. But, you know, those scenes that were shot or that were planned that never made it into the final picture, like that little soundbite from the trailer about their hairdressers. Those kinds of things are everywhere in old Hollywood and are so fascinating.
Oh yeah, these films, I mean, people complain about reshooting in quotes now. So as far as Preminger films, are there any other Preminger films that you feel are maybe underappreciated or films that you, if people liked Laura, you would turn them to?
I was thinking about, I mean, I feel like I've mentioned them, you know, there's Fallen Angel, which I really love. Angel Face, I kind of like, but not that much. But I was thinking about parallels in terms of reputation. And this is maybe a bit of an anti-parallel, but The Moon is Blue is a film that it was the first film that Preminger released as an independent producer because it didn't get the seal of approval because it was too salacious or too suggestive. You know, there's dialogue around virginity and marriage and just using all of these words that sound really tame to us right now, but were really, I suppose, incendiary or inflammatory in 1953, has given it this reputation of being a really important, really astounding film that must be seen by everyone. And it is quite fascinating, but it's also just not very exciting. Like, it's very talky. I feel like I'm just explicitly not recommending a Preminger film right now where you asked me to do the opposite.
Avoid this one.
It's really interesting because it kind of suffers because of its place in history and its weight of cultural import, whereas it's not actually salacious or risque or anything. But it's a fascinating document of, I think, 1953 and of Preminger and where Preminger kind of wanted to take screen material afterwards. And after that, he, of course, became an independent producer and started doing things that were really quite different.
I'm really into like the weird curios of history. And if there's one Preminger film that I think is of the utmost curiosity, it's Skidoo. It is one of the craziest movies ever made. The story, which I have no idea if this is apocryphal or not, I haven't got to that chapter of the book, is that Preminger's daughter got really into the hippie movement, and Preminger really just fully became really entranced by her social scene, and he literally wanted to make a movie about what the kids were up to these days. So he made his 1968 stoner movie. There's an acid trip sequence with Jackie Gleason. Carol Channing is in it. She sings the title theme, Skidoo. The end credits are sung word for word by Harry Nilsson. I'm very tempted to close our episode on Laura with just the Harry Nilsson credits song because it's so lovely, but it's terrible. It's truly awful. It doesn't work at all.
I think I've heard that. Yeah, I've never had the chance to see it, but you make it sound like even if it is terrible, who cares? What a chance to watch these peculiar things all in one place.
It's terrible. I'll never forget it. 10 out of 10. Would recommend. It's one of those great movies where its actual aesthetic quality doesn't matter. It's just you're watching it and you go, this is the most entertaining train crash I've ever seen. But it's also weirdly not cynical. Like you think of like, oh, Otto Preminger, 70-year-old Austrian dictatorial director trying to make a film for the kids these days. He's really invested in it, which is part of what makes the film so magical. It's one of the best disasters you can watch.
What a recommendation. Thinking about, how dedicated he was to getting Laura out the way that he wanted it, I can absolutely believe that he would make a film like Skidoo just in the way he wanted to.
I should also mention Groucho Marx plays a man named God in this movie. It's very ambiguous as to his divine providence. Here's where I say, thank you so much, Eloise, for coming on the show. It's maybe the biggest thing that makes this show so rewarding for me, especially as we hit the end of it, is just meeting people who are both much more enthusiastic than myself about these movies and also much more qualified to talk about them. I'm so happy that we could hear your thoughts on Laura and Preminger in general and Lubitsch.
Thank you so much, Devin. I will talk about movies anytime and anywhere.
Next week, David Cairns joins us to discuss A Royal Scandal, Dragonwyck, That Lady in Ermine, and the death of Ernst Lubitsch. Head over to ernstcast.com for information as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes and our Discord server. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. Brennen King was our dialogue editor for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you happen to use. It helps other people find our podcast and therefore find Ernst Lubitsch. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.
Stop! We are not through yet. And before you skidoo, we'd like to introduce our cast and crew.